script updated with verified data as of June 2026. The room was fine. Everyone else seemed fine. So why did you feel like you'd been running for hours? It wasn't the conversation, or the lights, or the music itself. It was that all of it arrived at once. And somewhere underneath the surface, your mind had already turned the volume up before the first word was spoken. Here is the part almost no one explains. The very same room that wakes one brain gently into its best self can quietly flood another that was already wide awake. Welcome to Psychology for Sleep, which raises the question that tonight follows. Slowly, with no rush to answer it. Why does the stimulation that sharpens one brain overwhelm another doing exactly the same thing? You don't have to solve that now. Tonight, the answer comes to you, not the other way around. Let your eyes find their own weight as the day's noise settles below you. You're resting now in the quiet your mind reaches for long before the room ever empties. Let's begin where the noise first becomes too much. You have left a perfectly good evening early, slipping out while everyone else seemed to be just getting started, and wondered why the same room that lit them up had quietly worn you down. That question is not a character flaw. It is a clue about how your brain sets its own internal volume. Scientists describe a baseline state called cortical arousal, the steady hum of activation your brain runs at before anything happens to it. Some brains idle louder than others. The puzzle underneath your whole life begins here, in a single honest question. Why does the very stimulation that sharpens one brain overwhelm another that is doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same room? You may have noticed it first as a child, when the birthday party that thrilled everyone left you craving the quiet of your own room. What felt like being difficult was something measurable. The brain maintains a resting level of internal activation even when nothing is demanding your attention. A kind of always-on background brightness. That brightness is not chosen, and it is not earned by effort. It is closer to a thermostat setting you were born with. For some people, that internal setting sits low and calm, leaving room for the world to add more. For others, it already sits high. So picture the room you left, not as too much, but as the same room meeting a dial already turned up. You can probably remember a moment when a friend begged to keep the night going while everything in you wanted to go home. That difference is not about willpower or warmth toward people. Researchers studying personality have long found that the brain's baseline arousal differs measurably from one person to the next, and that this difference shapes how much stimulation feels good versus how much feels like flooding. The same music, the same crowd, the same bright lights arrive at two nervous systems set at different starting points. One person is climbing toward a comfortable peak. The other has already arrived and is now being pushed past it. What looked like refusing joy was a full system protecting itself. You know the particular tiredness that comes not from doing too much, but from simply being somewhere too stimulating for too long. That exhaustion has a physiology, and it starts deep in the brainstem. A network there, woven through the upper brainstem, acts as the brain's master regulator of wakefulness and arousal. It decides how much of the incoming world reaches your cortex and how loudly it lands. When that regulator keeps your cortex highly activated by default, ordinary input, conversation, noise, movement, stacks on top of an already busy system. What others experience as pleasant background, you experience as accumulating weight. So consider that the fatigue was real, and that it was your brain doing exactly what it was built to do. You have likely been told, gently or otherwise, that you should be able to handle what everyone else handles. That advice misses something the brain has been quietly demonstrating all along. The reticular activating system, that brainstem network, behaves like a gatekeeper between the senses and conscious awareness. In some brains, the gate sits more open, letting a steady stream of stimulation pour through to the cortex. This keeps baseline arousal naturally higher. So the cortex is already working before the day even asks anything of it. You were not failing to cope. You were beginning each social hour several steps further along a path that others were only starting to walk. You may have envied the friend who seemed to gather energy from the very situations that drained you, growing brighter as the night grew longer. That contrast is not imaginary, and it is not a measure of who tried harder. When a brain begins the evening at a lower baseline arousal, added stimulation moves it toward its comfortable peak, and the climb itself feels rewarding. A brain that begins higher has less distance to climb before it tips past comfort into overload. Same party. Opposite directions. Picture one glass that still had room to fill, and another, already full, beginning to spill at the first pour. Neither glass is broken. You can sense it in small ways too. How a busy cafe energizes one person and frays another by the same hour. This is where a single idea quietly explains so much. The amount of stimulation that feels optimal is not fixed across people. It depends entirely on where the brain's arousal began. The science here points to an internal target, a level of activation where a brain feels most alert and most at ease. Reaching that target feels good. Overshooting it feels like static. Because your starting point sits higher, you reach your target sooner and overshoot more easily. So the world never changed on you. You have probably found yourself seeking a quieter corner at a gathering, drawn to the edge of the room without quite knowing why. That pull is not antisocial instinct. It is a nervous system regulating itself in real time, easing back from input that has carried it past its comfortable range. Notice, though, what the corner actually changes. Fewer signals reaching an already active cortex. A small physical lowering of the rate at which arousal climbs. Researchers describe this as moving back toward an optimal level of arousal. Not shutting down, but rebalancing. So the next time you drift toward the edge of a room, read it as a dial turning back toward the place where your own mind feels clear, not as hiding. You may carry a soft, private suspicion that something about you is simply wired wrong. Hold that thought gently, because the science says something kinder. Differences in baseline arousal are a normal, expected feature of how human brains vary, not a defect to be corrected. A higher resting activation is one perfectly ordinary setting on a spectrum that every nervous system falls somewhere along. There is no broken version and no correct version. Only different distances from the same internal target. The discomfort you feel in loud, crowded places is the predictable result of a calibration, not the symptom of a fault. You were never wrong. You were always just set differently. You have spent a long time asking the wrong question about yourself, asking what is wrong with me, when the truer question is, why does the same world land so differently on two minds? And this is only the beginning of what arousal reveals about the everyday tiredness you have carried. There is a name for the framework behind all of this, a way of understanding personality through the brain's resting level of activation. It proposes that the gap between those who seek stimulation and those who retreat from it traces back to where each brain idles. The exhaustion that felt like a personal failing turns out to be a starting point, one your brain set, long before any room ever filled. You can probably recall being praised for being a good listener, deeply present, while the same evening left you hollowed out. Both things were true at once, and the brain explains how. When baseline arousal already runs high, the cortex is richly engaged, which can mean noticing more, processing more, feeling the room more finely. That same richness is also why the room costs more. A psychologist named Hans Eysenck built much of his life's work around this idea, that introversion and extroversion reflect differences in cortical arousal rather than differences in how much someone likes people. Your depth and your fatigue were never separate. They flowed from the same well, set a little higher than most. You may have wondered why you can lose hours alone in thought, then feel scraped raw after 20 minutes of small talk. That asymmetry sits at the heart of Eysenck's arousal theory. In his view, introverts carry a higher baseline cortical arousal, so they are more easily pushed past their comfortable range by external stimulation. Solitude lowers the input, letting an already active brain settle. Crowds raise it, stacking new signals onto a system that had little headroom to spare. Nothing about you is contradictory. You can be both deeply engaged and quickly overfull, because both come from a cortex that was already awake when the noise arrived. You have likely felt the difference between a conversation that fills you and one that empties you, even when both lasted the same length. Eysenck's framework offers a quiet explanation. Because an introvert's brain begins nearer its arousal ceiling, the amount of additional stimulation it can absorb before tipping into overload is simply smaller. Think of it as arithmetic rather than fragility. Less distance between baseline and limit. The extroverted brain, beginning lower, has a wider margin to fill, which is why it can keep going long after yours has signaled enough. So when the conversation emptied you, picture a narrower band reaching its edge sooner. Not a weaker person trying less. You can sense the moment a good evening turns into one you simply have to leave. A switch flipping somewhere you cannot see. That switch has a shape in arousal theory. There is a curve scientists use to describe performance and stimulation. A little arousal sharpens you. More sharpens you further. But past a certain peak, additional stimulation begins to degrade how you feel and function. The peak is the same target a healthy brain seeks. Because your baseline starts high, you reach the top of that curve quickly, and then keep climbing into the downslope while others are still rising. The switch you felt was the top of the curve. Arriving early, you may have left a gathering replaying everything, mind racing, unable to power down even though your body ached for rest. That overshoot has a name in the science. When arousal climbs past its optimal point, the brain does not simply feel more alert. It begins to feel scattered, frayed, harder to organize. Past the peak of the curve, more input no longer helps. It interferes. For a brain already running high, an intense social setting can carry arousal well into that overloaded zone. So picture the racing mind afterward, not as drama, but as a nervous system caught above its comfortable range. slowly trying to find its way back down. You have probably noticed how a single quiet day can restore you more than a weekend of plans ever could. There is a reason rest works this way for you specifically. Lowering external stimulation lets a high baseline brain drift back down the arousal curve toward its optimal point, where clarity and ease live. The quieter the input, the closer you come to that internal target. This is why solitude is not avoidance for you, but recalibration. The literal lowering of a dial that the day keeps nudging upward. Your need for stillness was never weakness or coldness. It was the most direct route back to the level where your own mind feels like home. You can likely picture the friend who seems to wilt in silence, restless the moment a room goes quiet. Arousal theory explains them as the mirror image of you, an extroverted brain, starting from lower baseline arousal, sits below its comfortable target when things are calm, and that gap registers as boredom, even mild discomfort, seeking out people, noise, and novelty is how that brain climbs toward its optimal level. What looks like craving attention is really a nervous system reaching for the stimulation it needs to feel right. They are not shallow for needing the crowd, any more than you are broken for needing the quiet. You are simply starting from opposite ends of the same dial. You may have felt judged for needing a warning before plans, a buffer the others never seemed to require. That need makes perfect sense through the lens of baseline arousal. A brain that idles high has less spare capacity to absorb sudden, unplanned stimulation, so it benefits from approaching new input gradually rather than all at once. The buffer is not anxiety for its own sake. It is your system pacing the climb so it does not overshoot the curve. Extroverts, with more room below their target, can dive in without the same cost. So the next time you ask for a gentle on-ramp, hear it as a brain managing a margin that was always narrower than theirs, not as high maintenance. You have likely been the one who notices the flickering light, the background music, the tension between two people across the room. That heightened noticing connects directly to arousal. A cortex running at higher baseline activation tends to register more of the surrounding environment, picking up signals that lower baseline brains filter out unconsciously. The same openness that lets the world in so richly is also what fills your capacity faster. Your perceptiveness and your overwhelm are not two separate traits. They are one setting seen from two sides. You were never imagining the details others missed. You were simply built to receive more of the room, and to pay for it sooner. You can probably remember being told to just relax, as if your tiredness were a choice you kept making. The science offers a gentler truth. The level your brain idles at is largely involuntary, shaped by the brainstem's regulation of arousal rather than by attitude or effort. You cannot simply decide to lower your baseline the way you decide to lower your voice. What you can do is choose your environment. The amount of input you let reach an already active system. The control you have is not over the dial's resting point, but over how much the world turns it up. So treat the fatigue as a setting you can work with, never a failure of willpower to wish away. You may have wondered whether you would feel less drained if you just tried harder to enjoy it all. Arousal theory quietly answers no. Pushing yourself deeper into overstimulation does not raise your tolerance. It carries you further down the wrong side of the curve, past the peak into the zone where everything frays. The path back to ease is not more input but less. This is why forcing the long night rarely teaches your brain to like it. It only deepens the overshoot. You were not lacking effort or openness. You were being asked to climb past a peak your brain had already reached, toward a place that was never going to feel good. You have likely felt most yourself in the slow hour after everyone leaves, when the room finally goes still. That feeling of returning to yourself has a physiological match. As external stimulation falls away, a high baseline brain glides back down toward its optimal arousal, the level where thought feels clear and the body feels settled. The self that emerges in the quiet is not a smaller version of you. It is you at the place your nervous system was reaching for all along. The crowd did not show the real you and the silence the lesser one. If anything, the stillness is where your particular brain finally meets its target. You can probably sense, even now, how a calmer setting lets your thoughts loosen and spread out. That softening is arousal finding its level. When a brain that runs high is finally given less to process, the cortex eases from a state of overactivation toward a gentler, more open one. Here is the part worth keeping. There is nothing you must do to make it happen. Lowering the input is enough to let the system settle on its own. So let the relief you feel as a room quiets be what it actually is. Your brain returning, unhurried, to the resting place it knows, with no escape required. You may be noticing your own breath slowing a little as these words stay quiet and few. That, too, is the principle at work. Fewer signals reaching the cortex, the dial easing down toward its comfortable point. Everything in this hour is built around the way your particular brain meets the world, not by demanding more of you, but by asking less. The arousal that climbs so readily in a crowded room has space here to fall. You do not have to manage anything tonight. You only have to let the input stay low, and let a system that has been working all day begin, gently, to come down. You came in asking why the world tires you when it lights up everyone else. And the shape of the answer is now clear. It was never about the world at all, but about where each brain begins. What this tells us is not only about parties or crowds. It tells us something tender about how differently two people can experience the very same moment, and how unfair it was to measure yourself against a setting that was never yours. Yet a question still waits beneath this one. If the starting point explains the cost, what exactly is happening inside the brain when that cost is paid? And that is where the next stretch begins. Right now, in the quiet of this room, the arousal that climbed so easily today is doing the one thing it always does when the input finally thins. It is easing downward, not because you are forcing it, not because the day earned the rest, but because a brain set high still falls when the world stops adding more. You don't need to guide it. It knows the way down. What you haven't heard yet is what happens inside that high-running cortex while the stimulation lands. The machinery beneath the tiredness, the part the next stretch finally opens. For now, let the signals keep thinning. Let the dial keep easing. And from here, we drift on together. If you have felt seen even once in this quiet hour, the gentlest thing you can do is let this stay nearby. Leave it playing softly, and let the next stretch carry you further down, into the part of the night that asks nothing of you at all. You have probably noticed that some mornings you wake already switched on, before any coffee, before the day has even asked anything of you. Researchers trace much of that early-on feeling to a small bundle of cells deep in the brainstem called the reticular activating system, or RAS. Think of it as the brain's volume dial for the outside world. It decides how much of the noise, light, and movement around you is allowed to climb up into the thinking part of your brain. In some people, that dial simply rests at a higher setting from the moment the eyes open. What felt like being wired for no reason was your wakefulness arriving early, on its own. There is a particular kind of person who walks into a quiet room and feels something the others do not. A fullness, as if the room is already saying plenty. Scientists describe the RAS as a gate that regulates the steady flow of stimulation into the cortex, the brain's outer thinking layer. When that gate sits a little more open, ordinary input arrives louder and richer than it does for someone whose gate sits more closed. The hum of a refrigerator, a flickering screen, 3 conversations at once. All of it pours through more freely. You were not imagining the extra weight in the air. Your gate was simply letting more of the world in. Maybe you have wondered why you can read a room so fast. Catch the small shift in someone's tone that everyone else missed. That sensitivity is the other side of an open gate. Because more raw stimulation reaches your cortex, your baseline arousal, the brain's resting level of activation, already sits higher before anything happens. It is like beginning every day with the engine warm and idling, rather than cold and still. This is not anxiety, and it is not a flaw in your wiring. It is a nervous system tuned to register detail at a resolution most people never quite reach. The cost and the gift were always the same setting. You may have felt the difference between being pleasantly alert and being wound too tight, even though both feel like awake. Psychologists have a name for the relationship between arousal and how well we function. The inverted U, also called the Yerkes-Dodson relationship. Picture a gentle hill. As arousal rises from low, performance and comfort climb with it. You feel sharper, more engaged, more alive. But the hill has a peak. Past that point, more arousal does not help. It tips you over the other side into tension and overwhelm. There is an optimal zone near the top, a sweet spot of just enough. Your body has always been searching for that peak, even when you could not name it. Think of a day when you had too little going on. The slow afternoon, the empty waiting room, the meeting with nothing happening. That flat, restless boredom is real, and it has a place on the hill. At the low end of the inverted U, arousal is beneath the comfortable zone, and the brain feels understimulated, dull, vaguely hungry for input. This is why even calm people seek a little stimulation. A walk, a song, a conversation. Moving up the slope toward the optimal zone feels good because it is the brain finding its footing. Understanding this helps explain something gentler. Your discomfort in stillness and your discomfort in chaos are the same hill, measured from opposite ends. Now recall the opposite kind of day, the one where everything was happening at once and you felt yourself start to fray. That feeling lives past the top of the hill, on the far down slope where too much arousal becomes overwhelm. Once you climb beyond your optimal zone, additional stimulation stops sharpening you and starts flooding you. Focus narrows, thoughts scatter, and a quiet urge to leave begins to rise. The same input that felt fine an hour ago now feels like too much. Because your position on the curve has shifted. You were never fragile in those moments. You had simply traveled past the peak, where more of anything only takes away. Here is the part that quietly explains so much of your life. If your gate sits more open and your baseline arousal already rests higher, then you begin every situation further up the hill than the people beside you. You do not start at the bottom waiting for things to get interesting. You start part way up the slope, often already near your comfortable peak. So, a moderate amount of stimulation that places an extrovert in their pleasant, optimal zone can place you right at the edge of yours. Same room, same noise, same evening, but two very different starting points. What looked like overreacting was simply starting the climb from higher ground. You have surely watched it happen. The same party that lights someone else up is the same party slowly draining you. The inverted you makes sense of this without making anyone wrong. The extrovert often carries a lower baseline arousal. So the crowd, the music, and the motion lift them up the slope into their optimal zone. They feel switched on, finally, at their best. You arrive already near your own peak. So that identical wave of stimulation carries you over the top and down into overload. Two people, one room, opposite directions on the same hill. Neither of you was broken. You were simply standing at different places when the music began. Perhaps you have noticed that you cannot just decide to enjoy more. That past a certain point, willpower does nothing. That is because the curve is not a mood. It is a physiological state. When arousal climbs beyond the optimal zone, stress systems begin to engage, attention contracts, and the brain shifts toward a kind of guarded, narrowed processing. No amount of trying to relax pulls you back up to the peak from the far side, because the body is responding to the total load, not your intentions. Knowing this is its own quiet relief. The exhaustion was never a failure of attitude. It was a real position on a real curve. Think about how a long evening actually unfolds. Not one big shock, but many small inputs layered one on another. Researchers describe this as cumulative load. The way sensory and cognitive demands stack rather than reset. Every new face to track. Every conversation to follow. Every bright light and competing sound adds another increment of arousal. Nothing on its own is too much, but they do not subtract. They sum. So even a gentle gathering can slowly carry you up the slope across an hour. One quiet addition at a time. This is why you can feel fine at the start and undone by the end. The room did not change. The total kept climbing. Maybe you have been told you were fine an hour ago. So why are you fading now? Rather than a mood swing, picture the climb past threshold. Because your baseline began higher and the load kept stacking. There is a moment in the evening when the sum crosses the top of your inverted U. Before that point, you were near your peak, engaged and present. After it, every additional minute carries you further down the overwhelmed side. The shift can feel sudden from the inside, but the slope behind it was gradual. You did not suddenly become difficult. You simply, finally, crossed over. You may recognize the strange relief of stepping outside, into the quiet, for just a minute. That instinct is the nervous system reaching back toward its optimal zone. When you remove inputs, the noise, the faces, the light, the cumulative load begins to fall, and arousal drifts back down the slope toward the comfortable peak. This is why a few minutes alone can restore you so completely that you can return and continue. You are not being antisocial or rude. you were doing precise, intuitive self-regulation, lowering an over-high arousal back into the zone where you function and feel like yourself. Your body knew the way down before science ever drew the curve. Consider how differently two people can describe the very same long dinner. One calling it wonderful, the other quietly counting the minutes. Both are telling the truth. With a lower baseline and a more closed gate, the extrovert's arousal may never have reached the top of their hill. They could have stayed longer and climbed higher and only felt better. With your more open gate and higher starting arousal, the same dinner carried you over the peak well before dessert. The event was identical. The experience was opposite. Because experience is shaped by where on the curve each brain happens to sit. There was never a correct way to feel. Only two true ones. You might carry a small ache from years of comparing your stamina to others and coming up short. But stamina was never quite the right measure. What differs is not how much you can endure. It is where your optimal zone sits, and how quickly ordinary life carries you past it. A brain with an open gate and high baseline arousal reaches its threshold sooner. Not because it is weaker, but because it began the day already partly switched on. The same wiring that floods you in a crowded room is the wiring that notices the things no one else does. So set down the word stamina and pick up the truer one. You simply fill up faster. So return to the question underneath all of this. Why does the very same stimulation that sharpens one brain overwhelm another doing exactly the same thing? The curve now gives the shape of the answer. Two people share one room, one noise level, one evening, but they enter it at different points on the inverted U. Because one carries a higher baseline arousal and a more open gate than the other. The extrovert climbs toward their peak. You, already near yours. Slip over the top. Nothing was wrong with you and nothing was wrong with them. Your cortex had simply reached its bright peak first, while theirs still had slope left to climb. Something has quietly loosened in you over this last stretch. A little of the bracing you usually carry into a crowded room. Take one slow breath, and notice you no longer have to defend the way you fill up. Your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do tonight. Exactly the way it always has. We'll keep moving down this slope together, gently, with nothing left to prove. There is a feeling that arrives near the end of a long, ordinary day. A foggy, drained, scraped out feeling, as if your mind has been left out in the wind. What you are feeling has a name in arousal science. A brain that already runs near the top of its arousal curve does not have far to climb before it crosses the peak. And everything past that peak feels like noise instead of signal. The fog is not failure. It is your nervous system reporting, in the only language it has, that the climb is over and the descent has begun. The drain you feel is the cost of having started the day already partway up the slope. You may have noticed that you become quietly irritable long before anyone around you does. The small sounds sharper, the small requests heavier. Researchers describe this as the far side of the inverted U, where added stimulation stops sharpening performance and starts degrading it. For a higher baseline brain, the downward slope simply begins sooner. The same meeting, the same crowd. The same bright room nudges an extrovert toward their best and nudges you past your peak and into the part of the curve where attention frays. The irritability is not a character flaw surfacing. It is a tired arousal system asking, without words, for the input to finally stop rising. That specific wish to slip out of the room, to find a door, to be somewhere with fewer eyes, is one of the most honest signals your body sends. In arousal terms, the urge to escape is regulation in motion, an over-aroused cortex steering you toward less input so it can drift back down its curve toward the level where you think clearly again. It is the same impulse that makes you dim a screen that has grown too bright. So when that wish arrives, picture a well-built system crossing its threshold and steering, the only way it knows how, toward the place it can think again. Not a cold person leaving. Sometimes the words simply will not come. Mid-sentence, the sentence dissolves, and you stand there reaching for a thought that was there a moment ago. Cognitive scientists tie this to over-arousal directly. Past the peak of the arousal curve, the very systems that retrieve words and hold a plan steady begin to lose their grip. It is not that you are slow or unintelligent. It is that language is expensive, and a brain spending its reserves just to stay regulated has less left over for fluent speech. The blankness you feel is a system that has been running uphill too long, gently telling you it has reached the edge of what it can hold. There is a rawness that can settle over the senses late in an overfull day, fabric that scratches more than it should, a normal voice that lands like a shout. This sensory rawness is a fingerprint of over-arousal. When the cortex is already running hot, the gating systems that usually soften incoming signals work less efficiently, so ordinary input arrives without its usual cushion. The world has not changed. Your threshold for it has. And because the higher baseline brain reaches that point earlier, the rawness shows up while everyone else still feels fine. What feels like the world turning up its volume is really your system running out of room to absorb it. You may carry a quiet doubt about all of this, a sense that needing the quiet afterward is weakness, or rudeness, or proof that something in you is broken. Here is what the arousal model actually says. The downtime you crave is not a retreat from life. It is the descent down the curve. The unhurried slide from over-aroused back toward your natural baseline. It is the same recovery any system performs after sustained effort. No more shameful than a runner catching their breath. The need is not a defect bolted onto an otherwise fine brain. It is the second half of how an already awake brain stays well. And it was never optional. Think of how differently two people can leave the same lively evening. One lit up and reaching for more. The other emptied and reaching for the door. The arousal asymmetry explains the split without making either person wrong. They walked into identical input from opposite points on the same curve. One needed the evening to climb toward their peak. The other was already near theirs and spent the whole night past it, paying down a debt the first person never accrued. The exhaustion you carry home is not evidence that you enjoyed it less or tried less. It is the honest receipt for entering the room already awake. Consider how often the recovery itself gets misread by others, and quietly by you. The hours of low light and few words that you need afterward can look, from the outside, like withdrawal or coldness. Inside the arousal model, they are something else entirely. Active regulation, the necessary downslope, where an over-aroused cortex returns to a place it can think and feel clearly again. Skipping it does not make you stronger. It only leaves you stranded past your peak, where everything stays a little too loud. The downtime is not you opting out of connection. It is the precise thing that lets you return to it whole. Notice how much of the day's weight was never really about the events themselves. It was about where your brain started, and how much further the same ordinary hours pushed it. The arousal curve reframes nearly everything in this stretch. The fog, the irritability, the lost words, the raw senses, the longing for quiet are not separate flaws but one system, one signal, repeated in different keys. They are all the same brain saying it crossed the top of its curve earlier than the people beside it. Seen this way, the tiredness stops being a verdict on who you are and becomes simple information about how you are built. So here is the question that has run quietly under all of this. Why does the very stimulation that sharpens one brain overwhelm another doing exactly the same thing, beginning, at last, to answer itself? The difference was never depth of feeling, or willingness, or worth. It was arousal, one brain climbing toward its peak, the other already resting near it before the day began. You were not too sensitive. Your brain was simply already awake, and the world, all day, kept adding more. What looked like fragility was a system doing precisely what an awake system does when the input never stops. The rest of tonight follows that single truth down toward sleep. What just surfaced? That the tiredness was never proof of weakness. Only a brain that woke earlier and farther than the rest. You may be carrying that very feeling in your body right now. Notice your jaw, your shoulders, wherever the day still sits. There is nothing left to climb tonight. The slope only goes downward from here, and your system already knows the way. Let it begin. There is a quiet relief that arrives the moment the room finally empties. The arousal scientists describe does not vanish on command. It falls only when the input falls. When you lower the light, the sound, the number of faces asking something of you. The reticular activating system stops feeding the cortex its steady stream of signal. The baseline that sat too high all day begins, slowly, to slide back toward its optimal middle. This is not avoidance. It is a nervous system returning to the one place it can actually finish what the loud hours left unprocessed. You have probably noticed how much faster you recover alone than in good company. Solitude, for a higher arousal brain, is not refueling, and it is not loneliness. It is the input falling far enough that an over-aroused cortex can finally slide back down its curve. With no new faces to read, no tone to track, no exchange waiting for your response. The external load drops below the cortex's own internal hum, and arousal is free to descend toward its optimal middle. What feels like withdrawing from the world is your system finishing a descent the world never paused long enough to allow. Sometimes calm is not something you create. It is something that returns when you stop adding to it. A dim, familiar, low-novelty space lets the arousal curve drift back toward its center on its own schedule. You do not have to relax. You only have to stop feeding the part of you that was already running at full. The same wiring that floods so easily also settles deeply once input thins. A calm environment is not a luxury for the introverted brain. It is the missing half of how it was always meant to work. Peak, then return. You may have been told you drain too fast, as if it were a defect in your stamina. But a brain that reaches its optimal arousal sooner also reaches the gift hidden inside that same threshold: depth. When attention is not spread thin across constant stimulation, it pools. It goes down instead of out. The higher baseline that overwhelms in a crowd is the same baseline that lets you stay with one idea, one person, one feeling, far longer than others can. What looked like a smaller battery was always a different kind of focus. Think of the detail you caught that no one else seemed to register. The shift in a friend's voice, the thing slightly out of place in the room. A more reactive cortex does not just tire more easily, it notices more in the first place. Higher baseline arousal means lower thresholds for registering subtle signal. The cost is that nothing arrives quietly. The gift is that almost nothing arrives unnoticed. The same sensitivity that made the party too much made you the one who saw what mattered before anyone said a word. There is a richness to your inner world that does not always have an outside to match it. A brain already near its arousal ceiling stays activated longer after each exchange, turning experience over from the inside while the cortex is still running high. Researchers link this prolonged inward processing to the depth of reflection many introverts describe. Replaying, connecting, refining long after the moment has passed. What others release as they talk. You keep turning over because your cortex is still running high after the room goes quiet. The stillness you need afterward is not emptiness. It is where the lingering arousal finally settles into understanding rather than strain. You may have hung back when others rushed forward, and wondered if that made you timid. But a system, tuned to register more, also registers risk more readily. And that caution has its own intelligence. A cortex that takes in subtle signal notices the warning others miss. The inconsistency. The thing that does not add up. This is not fear running the show. It is a system refusing to ignore data it can plainly detect. So read the pause before you act, not as weakness, but as the part of you quietly keeping you, and the people near you, safe. It can feel personal, as if you chose to be this way and chose wrong. But these differences in arousal and reactivity are dispositional. They belong to temperament, the stable, early appearing style of responding that researchers have tracked since infancy. Long-term studies, like those following highly reactive children into adulthood, show this tendency is consistent across years and settings. You did not develop your sensitivity in response to failing at something louder. It was the baseline you arrived with, a way of meeting the world that was already running before you had any say in the matter. You may recognize this trait in a parent, a grandparent, a child of your own. Temperament is partly heritable, woven into biology, not chosen, not earned, not a habit you fell into. Decades of temperament research describe reactivity and arousal sensitivity as traits with real inherited contribution, shaped further by environment, but not invented by it. This is not a claim about a single gene or a tidy number. It is the established understanding that some of us are simply built to respond at a higher setting. You came this way. So did people you love. There is a particular kind of peace in learning you can build your days around how you are wired. If your cortex reaches its optimal arousal quickly, you can design for that, choosing environments with less novelty when depth matters, dosing stimulation instead of drowning in it. This is not lowering your ambitions. It is matching your input to a curve you finally understand. The same task that exhausts you in a crowded open room may feel effortless in a quiet one. You are not asking the world to be smaller. You are arranging it to fit the system you actually have. You have felt the difference between one good hour and 3 scattered ones. Managing arousal is mostly managing dose. How much input? For how long? Before recovery. A higher baseline brain does best with shorter peaks and real gaps between them. Not endless mild stimulation that never lets the curve fall. Spacing demanding moments. Leaving room to return to center. Is not indulgence. It is how this system sustains its strengths. The depth you offer at your best is real. It simply needs the quiet between the peaks to keep being possible. Recovery, you may have noticed, is not optional for you the way it seems to be for others. After a peak in arousal, the cortex needs time to descend before it can climb well again. Crowd this descent, and the next demand lands on a system that never reset, which is how good days collapse into depletion. Building genuine pauses between social or sensory peaks lets baselines settle, so your attention arrives fresh rather than frayed. The rest you take is not time lost from your life. It is the maintenance that makes the rest of your life work. Picture a single conversation, unhurried, where you finally said the thing you actually meant. Pacing around your arousal curve often means choosing fewer, deeper encounters over many shallow ones. A high baseline brain gives its best in low novelty, high meaning settings. One person in the head of 12. One room instead of a circuit of them. This is not antisocial. It is social in the only register where your system can stay present rather than overrun. You were never meant to be everywhere at once. You were meant to be fully somewhere, with someone, while it lasted. You may have spent years apologizing for needing what you need. But environments are not fixed, and neither is how you move through them. You can shape the light, the sound, the schedule, the exits. Small adjustments that keep your arousal nearer its center for longer. This is gentle work, not a project of fixing yourself. There is nothing broken to repair. There is only a curve to honor. Peak when it serves you. Retreat when it has had enough. Designing your days this way is not weakness accommodated. It is a strength, finally given the conditions it was always asking for. So return, for a moment, to the question underneath all of this. Why does the same stimulation that sharpens one brain overwhelm another doing exactly the same thing? You can feel the answer forming now. It was never that you were doing it wrong, or feeling it too much. It was that the input arrived at a cortex already near its peak, while theirs had room left to climb. Same room, same noise, same evening. Two different starting points. The exhaustion was never failure. It was simply a finely tuned instrument. Meeting a world calibrated for someone with more headroom to spare. There is freedom in dropping the word too. Too sensitive, too quiet, too easily worn out. Each one measures you against a baseline that was never yours. Once you understand arousal asymmetry, too much becomes simply differently set. The reaction that seemed excessive was proportionate all along, to your threshold, not to theirs. Nothing about you was inflated or out of scale. You were responding accurately to how much had actually arrived in a system already close to full. The problem was never the size of your response. It was the size of the yardstick others handed you. Consider what the word drained has quietly cost you. The shame folded into it. As if you leaked energy through some flaw. A system that reaches its limit early registers the faint, the subtle, the almost missed precisely because its threshold sits low. Sensitivity and early limits are two readings of one dial, not a battery that holds less than everyone else's. You were never running on a smaller supply of something the rest of the world had more of. You were calibrated to detect more. And detecting more, by its nature, costs more. You might catch yourself softening toward the version of you that struggled in loud places. Hearing drained easily, as set to a lower threshold, is not a trick of optimism. It is a more accurate description of the same mechanism. A lower arousal threshold means stronger response to weaker signal. That is, precisely, what high sensitivity means in any responsive system. The cost and the gift are not two traits. They are one trait seen from two sides. To wish away the draining would be to wish away the noticing. They were always the same wiring, doing exactly what it was built to do. There may be people in your life who run quietly hot the way you do, and people who do not. Both are real, and neither is the standard the other failed to meet. Arousal sits on a spectrum. Your place on it is simply where your reticular system holds the dial. The extrovert chasing more stimulation and you protecting yourself from it are not better and worse versions of one design. You are two valid settings of the same machinery. There is no center of the curve that counts as correct. There is only where each brain naturally rests. You may have assumed your depth was something you had to earn against your nature. A brain that fills quickly turns inward sooner. And inwardness, repeated over years, becomes reflection. Nuance, the long memory of feeling. Picture all those quiet hours after the bright ones. The replaying, the slow turning over, gathering, season after season, into the particular texture of how you think. What drained you in the loud rooms is the very thing that furnished the still ones with so much to consider. You can simply let that image sit there, unhurried, as the night thins. Imagine arranging one ordinary day entirely around your own curve. When you peak, when you fall, when you simply stop adding, not as a special accommodation, but as the obvious way to run the system you have. Front-loading depth when arousal is fresh, protecting recovery before it is forced on you, treating quiet as part of the work rather than a reward for it. This is what it looks like to stop fighting your wiring and start using it. The days built this way are not smaller. They are the first ones that ever actually fit. You can let go, now, of the long project of becoming someone with more headroom. A higher baseline is not a deficit to close. It is a different flaw to build on. And everything worth keeping about how you think and feel sits on top of it. Picture the noticing, the depth, the careful attention others come to you for. All of it resting on that very floor. The aim was never to raise your threshold. It was to let the days-long argument with yourself go quiet, and to feel where it already sits. There is a kind of rest that only arrives once the explaining stops, once you no longer have to justify why the day cost what it did. When you understand that your cortex was simply nearer its limit all along, the self-defense can finally set down. Nothing about tonight needs accounting for. The room was loud because it was loud. You registered all of it because that is what your system does. Underneath the long habit of apology, there has always been this, a wiring that was working perfectly, asking only to be understood instead of corrected. Feel how much lighter the explanation becomes when it stops being about your worth. The arousal you carry, the input it lets in, the recovery it requires. None of it was ever a referendum on whether you were enough. It was mechanism. Not verdict. A threshold. A curve. A baseline set before you could choose. The world kept arriving, and your brain kept meeting it at full attention. And somewhere in there, you mistook accuracy for inadequacy. You were not failing at being someone else. You were succeeding, all along, at being the system you actually are. And here, at last, is the truth the whole night has been moving toward. You were not too sensitive. Your brain was simply already awake, running at a higher baseline arousal, meeting the same stimulation from closer to its peak. And the world kept adding more. That is the science. Stated plainly, cortical arousal asymmetry. An optimal threshold reached sooner. A system flooding where another would still be warming up. Not a flaw. Not a fragility. Not a thing to fix. A finely tuned instrument, doing precisely what it was built to do. In a world that simply assumed everyone started from somewhere lower, arousal has a natural flaw too. A level your brain drifts toward whenever the input finally thins. Right now, without effort from you, it is settling there. The last facts tonight don't need your attention. They only need to find you already on your way down. By now, you may have stopped wondering whether something is broken in you and started to feel the shape of a simpler truth. Researchers studying baseline cortical arousal describe it as a setting, not a verdict, a level the brain holds before the day even begins. A higher resting level means less room is left before enough becomes too much. Nothing failed in you. You arrived already partly lit, and the long day simply kept reaching for the dimmer. There is a quiet relief in learning that a threshold is not a weakness. The reticular activating system, the brain's gatekeeper of arousal, simply runs a little more open in some of us. That openness was never carelessness or fragility. It is a calibration set deep below choice, deep below effort. You did not let the world in too far. The gate you were born with was already letting in plenty, faithfully, every waking hour. Maybe you have spent years apologizing for needing less of what others crave. There is nothing to apologize for. Remember the inverted U and its single peak. Each brain has a level where it works best, and yours simply sits closer to quiet. Beyond that peak, more input does not add brightness. It adds strain, sliding you down the far side of the curve. So stepping back was never avoidance. It was you steering toward the exact amount of world your particular system runs cleanest on. You are allowed to manage your own dose of the day without explaining it to anyone. The science of arousal regulation shows that lowering input is how a higher baseline brain returns toward balance. This is not retreat. It is maintenance, the kind every system performs. A quieter evening is not a smaller life. It is the correct measure of stimulation for a nervous system that began the morning already further along the curve than the people beside you. Think of how often you reached for a calmer corner of a loud room. The inverted you already know explains why that pull was wisdom, not avoidance. There is a peak where attention is sharpest, and past it, clarity slides back down. You felt your own peak arriving early, so you protected it. That instinct to step toward the edge of the noise was your brain keeping you near your best. You can let go of the old idea that you should want what everyone else seems to want. There is no single right level of arousal, only the level that fits a given brain. The extrovert leaning toward more and you leaning toward less are both simply moving toward balance from opposite sides. Neither direction is superior. You were never behind. You were standing at your own center, which happened to be quieter than the room expected. Perhaps the gentlest thing tonight is permission to honor your threshold instead of fighting it. Respecting your limit protects the very depth that makes you you. The same low threshold, near the peak of the curve, that floods in a crowd is what lets you notice what faster brains rush past. When you stopped pushing beyond your peak, you were not giving up. You were preserving the careful, attentive mind the whole night has been describing. The threshold was guarding something worth keeping all along. You may notice, even now, how a quiet room feels less like emptiness and more like room to breathe. This is your baseline arousal finding its preferred conditions. A high arousal brain does not need more to feel alive. It needs less to feel settled. The hush around you is not absence. It is the precise environment your nervous system was tuned for. The place where its constant inner brightness finally has nowhere new to be spent. There is no need to chase the energy you saw in others. What looked like their abundance is simply their climb toward a level you already hold. They reach upward for stimulation. You rest more easily without it. Their lit faces in loud places were never proof of something you lacked. They were just farther from their peak, traveling toward a brightness you carry quietly inside you all along. You can release the long habit of measuring yourself against people who run on different settings. The comparison was always meaningless. Two brains, two baselines, two entirely different distances to the same edge. There was never a fair contest to lose. The race you thought you were failing did not exist. You and they were simply walking toward the middle from opposite ends. Each tired by the part of the world the other found easy. Allow yourself the thought that your sensitivity to noise, to crowds, to long bright hours, was never too much feeling. It is closer to efficient signaling, a system that registers input strongly because it began closer to full, near the top of its curve. What overwhelmed you was not your weakness meeting the world. It was a system set to detect more doing its work. You felt more because you were built to detect more. And detection, gently, is a gift, not a flaw. Maybe tonight you can finally set down the verdict you have carried, that you were somehow made wrong. The steady answer from arousal research is that difference is not defect. A higher baseline is one ordinary variation among many in how human brains are tuned. There is nothing here to fix, nothing to outgrow, nothing to forgive yourself for. You were a working design, complete from the start, simply calibrated for a quieter share of the world. You have spent enough days bracing against rooms that ask too much. Now there is a softer posture available. When you choose the calmer setting, the lower light, the smaller gathering, you are not hiding from life. You are placing your brain exactly where it performs and rests best. That choice is not apology. It is alignment. And alignment, the slow matching of self to surroundings, is the most natural thing a nervous system can do. Notice how the day's overstimulation is already loosening its hold on you. With input falling, your arousal system begins drifting back down its curve, the way it was always meant to between demands. You do not have to manage this. It happens on its own, gently. The moment the world stops adding, the strain you felt was never permanent. It was a level, and levels fall. Yours is falling now, quietly, without any effort from you. So why does the same stimulation that sharpens one brain overwhelm another doing exactly the same thing? The answer, after all of this, is simpler than you feared. Not because one is stronger and one is weaker, but because each began the moment at a different point on the same rising curve. You were not the brain that broke under the noise. You were the brain that had already reached its bright, attentive peak before the noise even began. You can let the question rest now, because it was never really about the noise. It was about whether you were allowed to be the way you are. The answer is gentle. Yes. A brain that reaches enough sooner is not a brain that reaches too little. It simply finds its full measure early. There was nothing to correct in you. The whole time, you were complete, just quieter in your need for the world. Perhaps you can feel, in this stillness, that a quiet room is not where life stops. It is where your particular brain was always going to rest most fully. Low arousal surroundings let a high baseline system finally stop spending. The silence is not loneliness. It is fit, the soft match between what you are and where you are, right now. In this hush, there is no gap to close. You are simply, at last, in the right place. You no longer have to earn the right to need less. The understanding has carried that weight off you. Every threshold, every baseline, points the same direction. Your limit was real, reasonable, and yours to honor. You can stop bracing for the moment someone calls it laziness or coldness. It was neither. It was the honest edge of a brain that simply began each day already gently, fully awake. Feel how the effort of explaining yourself can finally fall away tonight. There is no one here to convince, no threshold to defend, no curve to climb. The understanding you reached does not need to be argued, only rested in. Your nervous system is settling toward its lowest arousal of the day, the place it has been moving toward since morning. You can let it arrive. There is nothing left to prove to anyone, including yourself. You may sense the room growing softer around the edges, sounds thinning, the day's brightness fading from your mind. This is your cortex easing toward its quietest state. Arousal sinking past the level any waking moment requires. You spent the day a little more lit than those beside you. Now that same brightness has somewhere gentle to go. It is not switching off. It is simply coming down, slowly, to the calm it was always built to find. There is nothing to hold on to now. The thoughts that asked so much of you all day are loosening. The way an over-aroused mind finally loosens when nothing new arrives to keep it lit. You do not need to follow them. Let them thin and fade. Your brain knows how to lower itself toward rest. It has done so every night of your life. And tonight it is doing so again, gently, without needing a single thing from you. You can let your attention grow soft and unfocused. A high baseline brain spends its waking hours quietly scanning, taking in, staying ready. Now that readiness is released, there is nothing left to notice, nothing left to manage, nothing left to filter. The vigilance that served you can rest. You are allowed to stop reading the room. The room is quiet. You are safe. And the steady inner brightness you carried all day is finally allowed to dim. Notice how little the world is asking of you in this moment. This, the stillness, the low light, the absence of demand, is the exact condition your nervous system has been moving toward since you woke. Not more, less. A brain that begins the day already awake, finds its deepest peace, not in stimulation, but in its slow withdrawal. You are in that withdrawal now. It is the most natural place you have been all day. You do not have to do anything to fall asleep. Your arousal is already low. Your cortex already quieting. Your whole system already gliding toward the rest. It knew how to find, long before you understood any of this. Sleep is not something you reach for. It is what arrives when a brain like yours finally stops being asked for more. The asking is over now. The quiet has come, and you can simply let it carry you down. You were never too sensitive, and there was never anything wrong with you. You were simply already awake. A quiet, attentive brightness that the world kept reaching toward, asking for more than you ever needed to give. Tonight, no one is asking. The world has gone soft and dim, exactly as your kind of mind always longed for. You can stop holding the day at its edge. You are enough, exactly as you are. And now you can rest. The brightness you carried all day was never something to dim out of shame. The same arousal that made one ordinary room feel like too much is the very thing that let you feel a quiet evening this deeply, this fully. It was never a fault in your wiring. It was always the level you were tuned to. Let your entire being dissolve into the soft, low-lit quiet your particular kind of mind has been moving toward since the moment you woke. You were never too much for the world. The world was simply louder than your threshold. And now, at last, it has gone gentle enough for you to let go. The world kept asking for more, and you kept wondering why more cost you so much. It was never a flaw in how you were made. It was a brain that began each morning already awake, already lit, already close to enough, meeting a world that only knew how to add. That does not make the tiredness smaller, but it makes it different, because it has a reason now, a level, a curve you sit on honestly. And a level is not a verdict. It is simply where you start. You leave tonight knowing something that changes what the next loud room costs you. Not because the room will be any quieter, but because you will walk into it knowing you were already awake before it ever began, and that needing less was never anything to be sorry for. But knowing where your brightness begins is only the first half of the question. If your brain was already awake before the world even started, then why does the rest you reach for at night sometimes feel just out of reach, even when nothing is asking anything of you? The next video in the Psychology for Sleep playlist begins there. You can allow these thoughts to dim now, like a bright room slowly lowering its lights, one by one, until only the soft glow you were always comfortable in remains. Let your body grow heavy with the ease that comes when nothing more is being asked of you. If sleep comes, let it take you down to the quiet your brain was tuned for long before the world ever raised its voice. If your eyes have already closed, there is nothing here worth opening them for. Rest well, quiet one. You were never too sensitive. You were simply already awake. And now, at last, you are allowed to come all the way down, where the science of the mind becomes the softest place to rest. Good night.